Hello, my name is Shaun Casteel. I'm the Extension Soybean Agronomist with Purdue University. Today I'm going to be talking about soybeans and hail damage or simulation of hail damage, in particular with leaf loss. We've all gone through this and had issues when a nasty storm has come through in the summer and just completely annihilated a field. And so the idea of what's really going on, how bad is it? Can we assess it? What kind of yield loss are we going to have? Is there any way to recover from that? And so here's an example of one that came through a number of years ago. Beans were later in development and just wiped out. You can even see the direction of the wind in that hail, and the picture off to the right here as you've taken off 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 leaves and retain 1 or 2 to 3. So again, you've got a level of defoliation that's concerning, certainly as we go into later development. And in that, we've been able to do a number of studies over the years, and that's what I'm going to share today. I think it behooves us to really understand what growth stages we're talking about, how long we're in there. And so today I'm going to be talking about hail damage on soybeans in reproductive phases. And so in particular, beginning bloom R1, that lasts about 5 days, so pretty short. And then when we go to R3, beginning pod, that's about 10-day window. And then the next set that I'm going to end today's talk with is the defoliations at R4. So it's about another 10 days in a normal developing plant. And then beginning seed has about 15 days. So as we progress through reproduction, we're going to have longer periods within those individual stages, but we're coming up on a short number of days to finish the season. So in other words, we don't have a lot of recovery time. And everything I'm going to be talking about today is based on indeterminate soybeans. So soybean flower, R1, just to set the stage, this is any open flower on the main stem node. Usually it'll occur from the 3rd or 6th node from the bottom. And then we'll have some flowering on the main stem as well as the branches. As we go to R2, this is considered full bloom. So it's any flower in the upper 2 nodes of the plant. And this is the case where we're starting to grow very rapidly, linear growth, if you will. This is a place where we normally like to have the beans already lapped and covering the row. So by July, give or take, is kind of what we're talking about. And then R3, this is as we advance through, and now we're talking about beginning pod development. And you have a pod that's about 3/16 of an inch or longer. And then this is going to be on the upper 4 nodes. So right now we're going to talk about R1 and R3 leaf defoliation. And in this, we did this for 3 years over at the West Lafayette site and kind of captured pictures as well to give you an idea of recovery time. And so here's an example within this study. We looked at maturity group 2.7 and a 3.7. I'll talk about the maturity group 2.7s first. This is on the order of a shorter season for us. In this geography, this is normally about 3.5 to 3.8 type maturity group, full season variety. So it's basically saying, is there a difference between a short season variety versus a full season variety? R1, these plants are flowering anywhere in the main stem. You can see that we've almost canopied, but not quite. These are 15-inch beans. And then now we've simulated leaf removal from hail. We've simulated, so this is physically just taking off leaves. We haven't taken off any nodes or stems, just the leaves. So this is 25% leaf removal, same maturity group, 2.7, 50% defoliation, 75%. So these are certainly going to start catching your eye. And then 100%. So all the leaves taken off, obviously they're on the ground, and continue to look at recovery rates and then ultimately what yield loss we saw. So to put those into a graph is this line up here where we've got days after defoliation and we have canopy closure. So basically we took those same pictures over time and then we counted the green pixels versus the ground area. So the 0% here in green is, okay, there's no defoliation whatsoever. On day 0, we had about 65% or so canopied with some of the software we use, and then continue to develop. And then by the time 14 days later, we'd reached 95% canopy. That 25% leaf defoliation did set us back, but not a large amount. So we're talking about, okay, instead of the 90% or so, we're about 80%. And then by 2 weeks, we've recovered back to the same level of the control. In other words, the beans that did not have any defoliation. Yellow is going to be our 50% defoliation, so taking a little bit longer to get that canopy back. So about 14 to 20 days to get it back. Now, that's not saying that it's the same amount of leaf area, right? We can talk about that. Control probably has more leaf area, more leaves per given area versus those that are defoliated, but it did occur in the middle of the season, which allows us time to get leaf recovery and probably minimal yield loss. 75%, again, that was the one that kind of started catching our eye more and more. As you track that across days after defoliation, it was more like the 3 weeks to get back to getting a canopy across that row. And then finally, the 100% defoliation, it was nearly a month, so 30 to 35 days after that event to get it to canopy again. And so if we're taking a month to canopy, so instead of July 1st, if you will, just a rough date, versus August 1, then you canopied, you certainly have less of a season left to produce pods and produce seeds. And so ultimately you would certainly see a yield loss in that scenario. So here's an example to give you the pictures of, I just picked out 50% defoliation R1. And as we continue to advance, the recovery time, 7 days, 16 days, and then certainly by those 3 weeks, you can tell they've already lapped and recovered like the graph had already shown. So this was with the maturity group 2.7. Now that 100%, all right, it took nearly a month to get that full recovery. And so we're at 16 days there and still not completely canopied by this point. So just giving a little bit of imagery to the numbers we had before. The question we had was, is there any difference between a 2.7, a 3.7, or a short season here on the left side versus a full season variety on the right? And so you can, again, kind of see where lightning strikes, if you will, with that defoliation event. This recovery period that we're up here in this upper panel is one we just went through. Now let's follow it on the maturity group 3.7. A 3.7, we did it when it hit R1. So these were not done the same day. They were hit when the growth stage was appropriate. Full season varieties typically don't have more leaf biomass. And so it was a little bit later, and the recovery phase was maybe even a little bit quicker when you think about a 50% defoliation. And then you go into the pink here being 75, and then the red being 100%. It pushed out about a month as well. Let's have another defoliation event occurring on that when the beans were at first pod. So advancing through our growth stages, so not first bloom, but first pod. Again, we have a pod that's 3/16 of an inch or longer. So it's later in the growing season when this is occurring. And now you have this defoliation occurring. You've got the same color coding in terms of here's the yellow, it's going to be 50% defoliation, but we've got a lot more biomass that's already been created by R3. So typically beans, if they have about 4 times the leaf area as a ground area, they're more than adequate for yield optimization. And in many cases, we're going to have beans that are going to be producing 4.5, 5, 6 times the amount of leaves as ground area. So if you take out, let's say, a plant that's a 6, which is fairly high leaf area to ground area, half that's taken away, well, you still have a dense canopy and have that canopied over that ground regardless of the number of layers. And then 100% defoliation dropping us down. And we follow that same kind of lightning pattern, if you will, on the maturity group 3.7s. More biomass. They did not, get defoliated to the same level in terms of what you see in a canopy closure picture, but certainly we lost half and more of those leaves. What does this mean ultimately in terms of yield? That's the question that we have. There's plenty that's going on. Here's what they look like at R3 at 50% defoliation a day after that treatment, 8 days, a little over 2.5 weeks, and then going on. So we've lapped fairly well, probably not fully, but close to it. The R3 version, I've just used maturity group 2.7 as an example. The 3.7 is going to show a similar pattern. So everything's taken off. It's just a stick, just leaves. We didn't do anything with the developing pods. And then you see this recovery just takes time. All right, we don't have the photosynthetic capacity. We're switching gears in terms of the way that we're producing this plant. This is a combination of flowers and pods and leaves. And so there is this disconnect between what the plant was wanting to do and now what it has to do in recovery phase. And then we still hadn't fully canopied by that 2.5, 3 weeks later, or 3.5, 4 weeks later. Yield, I've got them separated right now in this graph, but later you'll notice that I've combined them because the maturity group 2.7 in blue really didn't behave any different than the 3.7. You might say there's a slight difference with this greater defoliation, but it's quite minimal. So in other words, we have the solid line at R1 when we had 50% defoliation or 50% of the leaves taken away, and those recovered within about 2 weeks, if you recall. We're only talking maybe a 5-6% yield hit. Now, as we go to 75% and 100% defoliation, we're talking a yield loss of 20%. Still a fair amount, but not ending our season completely. Now, as we advance to R3 in the dotted line, again, we've got blue as a 2.7 and the green being 3.7. They were right on top of each other. Linear decrease, really didn't see any major differences at all. And so at this point, you think about a 50% defoliation event just on leaves, not stems or pods or anything else. We're nearly a 20% yield hit there. So where we had to have 100% defoliation R1, now at R3, we have 50% defoliation, has that same 20% yield hit. And this continues down the line as we lose more and more leaves. We're down to 40% yield hit, or we have 60% of our max yield. And then if we had all those leaves taken away, we're only reaching 40% of our yield potential, or if you want to reverse the thought process, you have a 60% yield hit. So we did this at R1, R3, and naturally we wanted to say, okay, how's this changed? Some of the insurance graphs that are out there and tables, our numbers on this were a little bit stronger than what's out there, so we wanted to follow through to see if things have changed since those tables have been created. So at R4, I think, again, it's good to give us an idea of what we're talking about with these growth stages. So R4 is going to be when you have a full pod or 3/4 of an inch pod or longer on the upper four nodes. We have this rapid growth in pods, and seeds are beginning to develop lower in that canopy. Flowering is pretty much complete. You might catch up 1 or 2 here and there, but any stresses that occur at this point really are going to be hitting your young seeds and developing pods. So in other words, if we have a stress, we can arrest seed development, we can lose pods and have some pretty significant yield loss. From R4, we're about 45 days from the beginning of maturity, R7. And then remember how long we're in these growth stages, okay? R1, we're only in there about 5 days, and then R3, about 10 days. Well, within this R4 full pod, we're in that growth stage roughly about 10 days. And then when we go to beginning pod, we're in that growth stage about 15 days. So these are longer periods of time in the reproductive phases. And so the time between these defoliation events were actually very similar to the earlier study, but different in terms of the growth stage and what's going on physiologically. In particular, I want to point out halfway between R5 and R6, we've maxed out in terms of our heights, our node development, our trifoliate nodes, and leaf area. In other words, we're slowing down on leaf or vegetative development and switching all into pods and seeds. So if we're going to try to recover from a leaf defoliation, we're going to be hard pressed to make that recovery versus an R4, or certainly as you go earlier in the season when you've got plenty of season to, okay, let's regenerate more leaves before we put energy into pods and developing seeds. So coming back to what we've done before, so over those years we had the R1, now I've just classed it in black, put those two maturity groups together, they really didn't behave any differently. So again, 50% defoliation for an R1, maybe 5% yield loss, and then by the time we go into 100% leaf defoliation, we're on order of 20-25% yield hit. Go to R3, that straight line decrease, so 50% defoliation, maybe on the order of 20-25% yield hit. And then we keep on going as we go down to taking away all the leaves and yielding maybe on order of 40% of what they should be, or 60% yield loss. Now, R4 and R5, brought those in as blue for R4 and R5 is in pink. Follow this trend. In other words, we saw no differences between an R4 defoliation event and an R5. Actually kind of shocked us a little bit. But in the large part, what should be the story here is that we still have significant yield loss in the order of that 20% or so, very similar to what we had for R3. Continue to go down to 75% or 3/4 of the leaves removed at R4 or R5, had a 40% yield hit. And then as we go in and take even more of the leaves, we just can't recover. So this is where that later growth stage really gets hit in terms of yield loss. So we have a 20% yield, or reverse it again, an 80% yield hit when we take away all the leaves. There's just not enough time for that plant to recover, and physiologically, it's where I made the decision, if you will, to just be producing pods and seeds. So a lot of this yield loss is coming at, we don't have the photosynthetic capacity to capture sunlight, create photosynthate plant sugars, and hold on to pods and develop seeds. And so we're losing those seeds, we're losing those pods, and we just don't have the pod generation, the seed generation from that. Some other components to think about whenever we look at defoliation events. We've just talked today about leaf defoliation, and certainly that's one of the main ones. But as you go later in development, so here's a case where off to the left, this is one of my plane date studies back when this hail event came through, and you could tell on the left is when those plants were at R4 of this hail event. So younger, more tender leaves, more apt to just get pelted with the hail, versus my earlier planting dates. Off to the right was R5 plus, is well into R5. So the leaves are older. Maybe you could think about they're even held on stronger by the plant. And so there wasn't as much of a defoliation from the same hailstorm when you look at maturity, or excuse me, growth stages. The thing that you do need to put in the context here is now you've got pod loss to consider. And so this yield loss that we saw from defoliation is one component, and we have to bring in, okay, are we losing pods? Are we breaking up pods? Seeds being lost. Here's another example of where a hail event has broken that pod. Okay, and so now we're introducing an opportunity for opportunistic pathogens to come in, and for this pod to completely die. You know, if we have this one pod on every plant, you know, half a bushel, 2 bushels starts to add up in terms of that yield loss when it's pod related. And then when you have the loss of leaf area, this is what I'm talking about. You have pods that are starting to develop, but there's nothing to contribute to it. There's no photosynthase, no plant sugars to continue to develop and fill that pod out. So we arrest the seed development. That pod is dead and dying. And then you can also see here in this case, this pod had a little injury point, and now saprophytic fungi are coming in to cause issues. So all those come into when we look at hail and leaf defoliation of soybeans. To wrap up this short little segment on defoliation of soybeans, I'd like to just make the comments that in our studies of a short season versus a full season variety, we did not see any difference in terms of yield loss between those at R1 and R3. So that's not a factor. It's whenever it hit those growth stages and doing those defoliation events. The yield loss wasn't any different. Recovery, maybe a little bit. Ultimately, it didn't make a difference in the combine. Yield losses at R1 were less than 20%. That was at the greatest defoliation, or taking away all the plants, all the leaves. We had a loss of 20%. But if we only had 50% taken away, it's on the order of maybe 5 or 6% yield loss. So nothing really to worry about, essentially. Yield losses at R3, or that first pod, were definitely more severe than R1. Examples I have here is when we had 50% leaf defoliation, we equaled about a 20% yield loss. We had 75% defoliation, yield losses were closer to 40%. They continue down that track. As our next study over the course of years had an R4 and R5 defoliation, they behaved very similarly. I didn't see any differences between those two growth stages over 3 years. And they were very similar to R3. So kind of giving us an idea that more of this issue is occurring in the middle of reproductive and continued that same yield loss pattern. But when we went above that 75% defoliation, when we got closer to the 100%, that's when we saw even greater losses from that R4 or R5 defoliation. Final point is just make that when we're talking about a defoliation event or a hail event in particular at R4 and R5, those are going to be more detrimental whenever we have direct effects. You know, in other words, direct hits to pods and developing seeds. So the yield loss is probably going to be an order higher than what I've represented on just straight leaf defoliation. So with that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions. If you guys want to email me and follow up on this, follow us up on the growing season, what we have here at Purdue, and look forward to having a conversation with you guys, and best of luck.